I'm really honoured to be asked to chair this special session on improving the communication of economics and economic statistics. My name is Sumit Chowdhury. I'm a senior economist at the Office for National Statistics. And this is clearly an important topic for myself and my colleagues. I'm involved in the production and development of economic statistics, but a core responsibility of mine is also communicating that to the wider public. This is not a new challenge, and this has been a long-standing one for all national statistical institutes, but also the wider profession. But I think it's gained more prominence in recent years, really for twofold. The first was the publication of the Bean Review in 2016, which really underpins how we've looked to transform ourselves as a national statistical institute. And one of the key recommendations there was to be much more attuned to user needs and focus on becoming much more of a service provider. And that includes the wider public and how we communicate with that. And I think that's taken most prominence over the last year or so as we look to communicate what's going on in the UK economy as we battle with the implications of the coronavirus pandemic. And so this is a topic that's not only relevant to kind of national statistical institutes, but also the wider research and academic community, policymakers and forecasters. And I'm really pleased to have the panel here to help provide some insights on how we think about that wider communication. I think there's really 2 points that we really need to tackle as part of this piece of work. The first is establishing the extent to which the public understands economics and economic statistics. And then I think secondly is how do we improve how we communicate, engage with the wider public so that we can bridge that gap in knowledge and understanding. And the 3 speakers we have today will hopefully all provide insights on these very topics. Firstly, Johnny Runge from the National Institute will provide some of his findings on focus groups and surveys to really get to the bottom of what does the public understand of economics and how do they form their perceptions. Secondly, James Mitchell, he will focus on how we communicate data uncertainty and how we think about the actual point estimates that we typically lead on. And Anita Broughton will work on terms of her work into the policy implications and how we can think about communications as a policy tool. I'll then invite Mike Hughes of the Royal Statistical Society to share his views and how we can think about communication as the wider profession. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A panel at the very end, which will last around 20 to 25 minutes or so. So I encourage everyone to submit their questions in real time, and I'll look to collect those and invite the panel for their views at the very end. If there are any points of clarification, I'm happy to pick those up at the end of each speaker. So without much further ado, I'll invite Johnny to come in. Johnny.
Okay, I'll just share my screen, which is hopefully visible now. So yeah, thank you so much, Sumit. I'll just dig straight into it. So yeah, this was a project with me and a colleague at NISA and in collaboration with Full Fact, RSS and King's as well. And it was part of a research program of ESCO, and it was really to understand how people think about economics, how they understand different economic concepts, and how they then go on to judge and evaluate main economic indicators. And the main aim is kind of try to inform how we as a profession improve our communication to the public, but with this kind of acknowledgement that to do that, we need to understand better how people actually think and understand, think about and understand economics. So we've looked at various things. The report is already, or the first report is already published, was published in November. Today I'll look a bit at some of our broader findings and maybe also get into some of the findings on unemployment or inflation, but I'll encourage you obviously to look at the report online as well to get some more in-depth insights. So what did we do? We did 12 focus groups with 130 people in pre-COVID times. And the sample kind of like included a mix and a variety of different people. But it's important to say that this kind of like sampling and analysis of qualitative data is, your aim is to capture the breadth and depth of views and perspectives within the population, it's not necessarily to representative or generalizable to the wider UK population. We did also do a YouGov survey with a representative sample exploring some of those same issues. So one way of one way of interpreting our report is that public understanding of economic concepts is relatively limited. It's especially weak on concepts related to the national, like more abstract economy that's seen as less important to people's everyday lives. So GDP is a main example of that. But there are pockets of public economic expertise, usually driven by the relevance to their everyday lives and personal finances. And just more broadly, our research shows that people have quite a rich and nuanced insights. They kind of like live and breathe the economy every day. And on some topics, they have a lot of insight, but from a different perspective than economists, and that's important to recognize. So that means people understand economic issues through like kind of their familiar personal economy. So a good example is interest rates, where people will show very great knowledge on, kind of like, driven by the impact on mortgages, especially, that they'll, explain very well what interest rates are, what happens when they increase and decrease, and the current levels as well, and so on. But where they have less knowledge is how interest rates relate to the broader economy, to inflation, who sets interest rates, why they do so, and so on. Public understanding of numbers is also weak. People lack confidence in assessing and judging economic figures when they're reported as numbers or percentages and so on. People, quite often numbers are quite meaningless to people. They prefer to speak in broad terms, so about low unemployment or rising unemployment, rather than about 5, 10 or 30% unemployment. Doesn't make as much sense to them. Part of that reason is probably because they don't necessarily know how economic figures are collected and measured, and who they're produced and published by. You could say that's not very important for the public to know, but the thing that we identified in our focus groups was that people, it quite often leads people to express a lack of confidence in economic statistics, which I'll talk more about on unemployment. But more broadly, it was clear that many participants are keenly aware that data and statistics can be used to promote a particular viewpoint. People are like kind of naturally very skeptical about any data they see. And I think what our research shows that even with official economic data, which economists often trust a lot, the public, partly because they're not sure who produces them or publishes them, they kind of like subject that to the same public scrutiny, so to speak, as any other data. And then the last point on the general findings is that there's a variety across key demographics in terms of interest, knowledge, and confidence, and so on. It should be said here that our survey and other surveys in this field tend to look at kind of big macroeconomic numbers, and some of these variations might be different or non-existing if you looked at minimum wages, benefits, and so on. Then it's also clear that personal circumstances generally and kind of previous formative experiences tend to shape people's understanding of the economy, and especially experiences of economic crises. So economic crises like the current one, or like the 1970s or 80s with high interest rates, high inflation rates. That's something people really remember. The times of economic crisis are times where people are really interested in the economy. They learn a lot about the economy, and that's something we need to bear in mind during times like these. Okay, I'll just whiz through very quickly some of the findings in the chapters that we have in the report. So on the economy general, there's three things that I think are worth mentioning. Is that the positive is that most British people are incredibly interested in the economy and economic issues. It might be more in terms of like the personal implications and consequences it has, but they are deeply interested, and they often admit and regret that they lack a detailed understanding of the economy, and they wish themselves and their kids were taught more widely in schools. The not so good thing is that people very often directly or indirectly speak in very negative terms about the economy. They're disillusioned with the economy. They don't see it as something that enables them to raise their living standards or have success, but it's this kind of external negative force that sometimes kind of pops up and then threatens to, hit them on their living standards, their job prospects, and so on. Okay, so the first of these concepts, unemployment. So unemployment, the main story here, I noticed the unemployment rate was obviously a bit lower at the time of this research than it is now, but the main story also in subsequent research that we've done is that people are incredibly surprised and sometimes shocked by how low official unemployment rates are, and they just kind of like compare it to their everyday lives, their the friends and family and stuff, and their local community, and just don't feel like that it must be higher than this figure. And quite often that then leads to a lack of confidence in the unemployment statistics, which manifests itself in two different ways. Many participants, many people then go on to like think about who's the source of these statistics, can I trust them, and so on. And it's very clear that when people start thinking about the source of unemployment statistics, they kind of like logically assume that it's probably based on benefit claimant data from job centers, or held and collected by government departments, or tax data alternatively. And more broadly, people also often associate economic data with politicians who, quite often take ownership and present and discuss these figures in the news. And kind of like together that leads people to believe that the figures are massaged, fudged, manipulated, and so on to reflect well on government performance. The second way it manifests itself is in discussions about actually who, in more like kind of like measurement discussions ad hoc by participants, they kind of start questioning, how do you capture, can you accurately capture different jobs and different people in official statistics? And maybe some of these jobs are not accurately captured. And there's especially a recognition that the boundaries between employment and unemployment are increasingly blurred nowadays. So that's things like 0-hour contracts, part-time jobs, like different gig economy, bogus self-employment, all those type of different types of jobs where there's a very strong theme from a lot of people that what matters is job quality. What matters is, hours, pay, job conditions, and so on. And maybe you cannot always kind of like compare two jobs like for like when you speak about labor market performance. Then there's, I'm not going to go into much detail about it, but there's also just generally this common assumption that people are recorded as either employed or unemployed, that the unemployment rate is this kind of binary measure. That's kind of just the assumption. People haven't thought otherwise, and they're actually incredibly interested, but also very surprised when they hear there's a third category and don't quite understand, and sometimes that also creates skepticism when you try to explain how that third category fit in. But they're also very insightful when you start prompting people with different categories: stay-at-home parent, people working 4 hours a week, or whatever. There's incredibly insightful perspectives from most people. Okay, inflation. Just going to go through this quickly. So, fairly good understanding of inflation. People related to price growth very often. There's the same story that people feel like the numbers should be higher, at least in the pre-COVID days. And there's still the same story that people then are kind of like ad hoc starts talking about. I wonder what they're looking at, and can this be why the numbers is so low? And you have some of the things listed here that they talk about. The last bullet point kind of summarizes a lot of this, that there's this suspicion that what's in that number is someone else's inflation, not my own inflation. And there is this general acknowledgement, directly or indirectly, that prices can vary depending on consumption patterns and regions and so on. And again, the same like kind of theme with people prefer speaking in broad terms about different levels of inflation. And the same theme again with the personal economy rather than the national economy. So people do pay close attention to price changes in their everyday consumption, but they don't actually call that inflation rate or speak about it in those terms. They do often relate it to wage growth and come very close, very often actually, to define real wages, even though they don't speak in those terms. But as the last bullet point says, the national economy, how it relates, the inflation target, how it relates to interest rates, kind of like broader questions about why prices rise and all these kind of things. Maybe unsurprisingly, people understand that much less so. And then just, I think I'm running out of time. So the way forward, I think we need to improve our communication as an economics profession, but we also need to improve our public engagement, building trust and so on. And the kind of like last pillar is obviously that much more can probably be done in terms of incorporating economics into education initiatives and so on. What we'll do from ESCO and NISA and so on is that on the back of these findings, we want, and we're already speaking to individuals and organizations that are interested in these kind of issues, and we want to like kind of discuss these findings and draw out implications about communication to the public. So if you want like a more detailed kind of seminar or something in your organization, please get in touch with me, and you can use that kind of as a starting point for conversations about how do we improve as an organization your communication to the public. Just the last thing I want to say is that I think going forward is really helpful to frame this area as consisting of two different and parallel ways of understanding the issue. So basically, there's a public understanding of economics and there's an expert understanding of economics. And I think what we need to do is take these two perspectives equally seriously, rather than necessarily always seeing our version, the economist version, as the correct version, and then the other simply as a result of like ignorance, biases, lack of information, and one that needs to be corrected. Because I think the truth is that we need to reduce the gap between the groups, which does mean bringing the public closer to economists through educating, communicating better and so on. But I also think it means that economists need to get closer to the public because they, as I said before, they live and breathe the economy every day. They have very good perspectives and insights and so on. We need to listen to and learn from them and build trust and so on, which is the background for some of our current work, which basically involves workshops where we're doing the same types of focus groups with members of the public, but have an economist join in and listen and learning, and also interacting and participating in the conversation as well. But yeah, looking forward to the Q&A and to listen to some of the other presenters. Thanks.
Thank you, Johnny, and perfectly to time. I will hand over to James now, if that's okay. As I said, we'll take Q&A at the end.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen, the right screen. Well, I've got two screens going on here. Okay, hopefully everyone can see this slide pack. Well, as I say, I'm James Mitchell, and today I'm going to summarise work that Anna Galvao and I have been undertaking over the last couple of years. And as alluded to earlier, this is like Johnny's research. This project is also ESCO supported. I should also add the standard disclaimer that these views are our own, not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, as again, as Sumit touched on in the introduction, this project is all about trying to understand the public's perceptions of data uncertainty. I mean, in these uncertain times, none of us need telling that the future is uncertain, but of course, good economic statisticians, policymakers are very aware that the past is also uncertain. As we all well know, historical economic data, the sort Johnny was talking to us about just now, are uncertain. They're subject to various types of sampling and non-sampling errors, which mean that economic data tend to be revised. And so while this data uncertainty is well known to policymakers, and indeed there's a growing sort of academic research literature using real-time data. There's growing publication and use of real-time data sets published by statistical offices and central banks. So whilst this is all great, it's unknown the degree to which the public understand and interpret data uncertainties when presented, let's say with the latest GDP numbers. Certainly, an observation is that statistical offices internationally in general, when publishing the economic data, certainly our focus in this paper when publishing GDP data, they present those GDP numbers as point numbers, as single valued numbers. In fact, the ONS is something of an international exception in referring to its GDP numbers as estimates, providing, as I'll come on to talk about, at least a qualitative impression of data uncertainty. But certainly, as it's fair to conclude, and work by Charles Mansky and others also expresses this, that headline press releases across national statistical offices focus on point numbers, or as I said, at best, estimates. So the aim of this paper, using some experimental surveys, which I'll summarize in a minute, was to try and sort of tease out, to try and begin to bottom out when presented with these headline point estimates for GDP. How do the public understand these data? Do they take them at face value and think, well, the economy grew or contracted at exactly the rate that the ONS or the BEA says? Or do people subjectively, one way or the other, infer their own error magnitudes around the point numbers presented to them? And as I say, frankly, we don't know how the public understand data, these point data when presented to them, hence the motivation for this research project, which I should add very much builds on from what Johnny was talking about, and indeed benefited from the advice and input of Johnny himself. Okay, well, to try and sort of fill this information gap, to try and understand if and how the public understand and interpret data uncertainty, we have undertaken now 2 waves of a randomized controlled online experiment. Actually, that's misspelt, but sorry for the typo. And we use these randomized controlled online experiments to, as I say, to tease out what the perceptions of uncertainty in single valued GDP numbers of the public are. And secondly, and importantly, I mean, exploiting the randomized nature of the trial, what we're going to do is split the public into different treatment groups, a control group, who are effectively presented the current ONS or something that mimics the current ONS GDP press release. That's what's given to the control group. And then to the treatment groups, we present alternative ways of qualitatively and or quantitatively communicating data uncertainty. And obviously it's that randomization that lets us identify the causal effects of if and how uncertainty communication matters, and in particular, does the manner in which uncertainty information is visualized and communicated affect perceptions and reactions of the public to data uncertainty. So we undertook the first wave of this survey back in 2018. So these are nationally representative surveys, sampling back in 2018 over 3,000 members of the UK public. With the kind support of the ONS and ESCO, we were able to run a second wave of the survey in the height of the pandemic of last year. Enlarged the sample to 4,000 nationally representative members of the UK public. And as I'll go on to say, this allowed us to assess two more, this enabled us to apply two additional treatment groups to the online experiments. So what we're going to do is be splitting the public into the control group and the different treatment groups. 5 treatment groups back in wave 1, 7 treatment groups in wave 2, and each of these treatment groups is going to be presented what Anna and I call a different communication tool. So I'll give you a sort of a visual impression of what those communication tools look like in the subsequent slide. But say how the survey effectively works is, we have sort of 9-10 initial questions which tease out some prior to treatment, prior to the respondents being presented with the communication tool, which let us collect some background data on individuals, and in particular also test their understanding of what GDP as a concept is. Because this particular survey, our intention was not to try and fill information or educational gaps that respondents, that the public may have. It was effectively the public were given a multiple choice question to where they were allowed to try and describe what GDP measures. If they did get that question wrong, we would then politely, I hope it's polite, remind them what GDP actually was before the survey continued. So we collect those background questions, then we treat the groups with the communication tool, and then the survey proceeds commonly across the control and treatment groups by asking the public what they make of the GDP estimates, and indeed it asks the public how confident they are that the GDP grew by the exact rate indicated in the press release, the mock press release, and indeed it asks them to provide some probabilistic assessments of how sure they are GDP grew within particular confidence bounds. Because there's often believed to be a risk that communicating uncertainty may erode trust in the data, or indeed in the data producer itself, we also ask some questions which try and get at this, to try and see whether communicating uncertainty in a more upfront quantitative visual manner, does that erode trust in the data? Does it encourage the public to think that the ONS data revisions are due to mistakes at the ONS, rather than, which of course is the case of the majority of data revisions, just due to updated information becoming available to the ONS? I say to maximize realism, both of the two surveys ask about the latest GDP estimate at the time of running the survey. It's 1.5% back in 2018 and minus 21.7% in 2020. Obviously absent, the ONS themselves do not explicitly quantify the GDP data uncertainty. So to do so, in order to be able to visualize uncertainty for some of our treatment groups via the different communication tools, we as sort of the people running the survey have to quantify the data uncertainty. We do so by measuring what Mansky calls transitory data uncertainty. So effectively what we do is, based on a historical analysis of how the first GDP estimate from the ONS compares with estimates 4 years later, we compute the standard deviation of that, of those estimates. And as you see, that implies standard confidence intervals, let's say around a point estimate of 1.5, of 0.4 to 2.6. So as you can see, around moderate growth, it looks like quite a wide band, but of course around the minus 21.7% growth, the bound perhaps looks a little narrower, although of course it's exactly the same standard error estimate. Okay, well, let me now just run through what those communication tools presented to the 5 groups in wave 1 and 6 groups in wave 1 and 8 groups in wave 2 are. As I say, group 1, the control group, is presented in effect the current ONS press release. The black font here indicates the wording used in wave 1. Similar wording was used in wave 2. But of course, around the minus 21.7% estimate. So you can say the control group are just told GDP is estimated to have increased by 1.5% during the last year. So no explicit indication of data uncertainty beyond perhaps the aforementioned reference to GDP being an estimate. Now, as you can see, as we move down the groups here, we provide additional first qualitative, then qualitative and quantitative uncertainty information. Group 2, for example, we emphasize that GDP grew by about 1.5%. Group 3 are given a little bit more information about why these revisions tend to happen. Group 4, run just in wave 2, in fact uses the wording adopted by the ONS themselves in the height of the pandemic, as we see, sort of again emphasizing, due to the pandemic, the particular uncertainties, heightened uncertainties associated with GDP estimation in the pandemic. And then groups 5, 6, 7, and 8, as we'll get on to see, provide not just those qualitative indications of data uncertainty, but different visualizations and representations of quantitative data uncertainty. As I say, based on that aforementioned modeling of data revisions that Anna and I conducted. So you see group 5 there. And excuse the fonts are a little small here, but hopefully it gives you an idea. As effective as we move down the groups here, we're providing additional information. So whilst if you forgive me flicking back, group 5 we're just presented with an interval estimate. Group 6 are given a density strip. This is a third of probability mass in each of those shaded blue areas. And group 7, of course, given something that resembles the famous Bank of England fan chart. And finally, group 8, run just in wave 2. In fact, adopts the visualization used by Summit and the ONS, again in the height of the pandemic, whereby we get a confidence interval around not just the latest GDP estimate, but also around the historical path of GDP. So as I say, we run these 2 waves, split the public into the control group in the different treatment groups to try and understand how they understand data uncertainty and what the implications of communicating data uncertainty in different ways are. And the summary results and the final slide are here. Reassuringly, the majority of the public, so over 50%, did understand that there was some uncertainty inherent in those GDP point numbers. That is when they're presented with the 1.5 or minus 21.7%, they weren't 100% confident the GDP was exactly that number. They were expecting it to be around that number. However, despite that feature, we do find that as we progress through groups 2 through to group 8, by providing additional uncertainty information, does encourage the public additionally not to take those GDP estimates at face value. In particular, the quantitative communication tools are effective in encouraging the public to correctly infer the degree of uncertainty between the different confidence bands. Because recall, Anna and I, based on our as producers of not just the point estimate, well, albeit that's from the ONS, but as producers of the uncertainty around that point estimate, we know what the probability of GDP being between particular bounds is. So some of our questions tested out how able were the public to infer correctly the probability of GDP falling between particular bounds. And we found it was the quantitative, the increasingly, in a sense, sophisticated communications of uncertainty that were particularly effective at anchoring the public's expectations of data uncertainty. Those expectations of uncertainty could be somewhat wild, somewhat all over the shop, absent communication by the ONS of data uncertainty. So in short, what our results are saying is that the current practice, yes, the public are aware that the GDP numbers are uncertain and liable to be revised, but frankly, they got quite wild views about the degree of uncertainty around that estimate. So communicating that, quantifying and communicating that uncertainty nudges the public in the right right direction. As I say, we find it particularly effective to communicate that uncertainty information quantitatively using these intervals, density strips, and bell curves. We also do find, drawing on what Johnny said, that there are important heterogeneities between different members of the public, as teased out via those introductory questions I mentioned. In particular, we find that those members of the public who do understand what GDP is, who sort of pass the GDP test question and who do trust the ONS, the communication tools are particularly effective on them, but they still work, albeit to a lesser degree, for the residual members of the public. And importantly, and finally, you know, this encouraging result is not offset by any erosion in trust in the ONS. In other words, communicating the uncertainty quantitatively, yet let's say via the bell curve, does not encourage the public to think that the data revisions, the data uncertainty is due to vested interests at the ONS in government more generally, or indeed due to mistakes at the ONS. So let me stop there, and I look forward to any questions on the research that you've got later. As I said, I believe Anna's on the call also, so yeah, hopefully we can have a good question and answer session later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. And again, excellent timekeeping, making my life very easy here. So we'll now go to Nida, please, for her insights from the Behavioural Insight team and communications as a policy tool. Over to you, Nida.
Thanks very much, Sumit. I'll just share my screen and get that set up. Great, hopefully you can see that. Sumit, maybe interrupt me and shout if there are any problems. But thanks very much for inviting me today. So I'm Nida Broughton, I'm Director of Economic Policy at the Behavioural Insights team. And the paper that I'm presenting today is on enhancing central bank communications using simple and relatable information. This is a result of a collaboration between the Behavioural Insights team and the Bank of England, and the article outlining these results was published in the Journal of Monetary Economics back in 2019. And also big thanks to my co-authors on this, Jana Termer and also David Bolat and Eric Hawksack, who work at the Bank of England. Before I dive in, let me just say a quick word about the Behavioural Insights team for anyone who isn't familiar with us. So we're an organisation that started out in number 10 back in 2010 as a pretty small team at the time to apply behavioural insights to social public policy problems. We're now a social purpose company, still part owned by governments, but working with governments and institutions across the world. And our economic policy work covers a range of areas from business productivity to consumer policy to more macroeconomic focused work, of which this paper is a part. So first of all, why did we do this research in the first place? So back in the 1930s, Sir Stephen Harvey, the then Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, summed up the bank's approach to external communications by saying that it was to leave our actions to explain our policy, adding that it is a dangerous thing to start giving reasons. And fast forward 9 decades, I think we can all see and have seen that central banks have moved away from this position of never explaining to a position where increasingly actually the explanation is the policy, as the former Fed Chair Janet Yellen said. So, you know, comms as a sort of policy tool in and of itself. So external communications now an increasingly significant part of central bank activity. And that goes from your sort of more complex reports, like the one on the left-hand part of the slide, to even, you know, more sort of fun graphics and cartoons, all kind of in the name of trying to explain more to both experts, but also the general public what the bank is actually, what central banks are actually doing. And so with all of this going on, the question of how to make central bank communications more effective is becoming more and more important, really for all the reasons that my co-presenters, Sumit, James and Johnny have really said so far, around the fact that communications itself is a potential policy tool for economic institutions and central banks, but also to tackle this twin deficit, as Andy Haldane the Bank of England puts it, of poor public understanding and trust in what central banks and economic institutions do. So what were the research objectives of this particular project? We took one particular example of Bank of England communications, its inflation report summaries, which, we started this project in 2018. At the time, the Bank of England had recently introduced some new versions of its inflation report summaries designed to make them much more accessible to the UK public. And these inflation report summaries in particular set out the MPC's decision on interest rates and all the economic data that sits behind that. And these were the three objectives that we had. Firstly, we wanted to evaluate the impact of these summaries on public comprehension and trust. We then wanted to isolate the causal effects of things like visual elements, length of the summary, readability scores. And finally, we wanted to evaluate a new intervention that sought to make all the information as relatable as possible to people's lives. So how did we do this? Our experimental design is very similar actually to what James presented in his piece. So we did an online randomized experiment using BIT's predictive platform, which has access to hundreds of thousands of participants. Tested 6 alternative versions across 2 different experiments, all set up as randomized controlled trials. So that means each group only saw one version of the particular summary that they were assigned. After reading the summary, participants had to answer a series of comprehension questions about the material. That's how we tested whether they'd understood or not. And then we also asked them a few questions around trust, in particular, asking them whether they think the information they've seen is trustworthy. And finally, we also captured a range of demographic characteristics so that we could see if there was anything interesting going on amongst particular subgroups. So the first thing we did was to simply take the existing materials and evaluate them. So we tested 2 summaries that the Bank of England was already using at the time on its website. So these are sort of 2 screenshots of what they looked like. There's a monetary policy summary, which is a much more kind of traditional, complex summary, very kind of typical of what you might see across many kind of central bank websites. And then the one on the right is a visual summary, which the Bank of England had recently introduced at the time, intended to make all of this information much more accessible. Note, by the way, and this will become important later, it's called a visual summary. It does have visuals in, but it does also have a few other things going on. It uses simpler language, for one thing, so it's more sort of readable. It also is a different length to the monetary policy summary. So that becomes important when we think about how to interpret the results. So what did we find when we tested these 2 side by side amongst our participants? We found a significant increase in comprehension scores coming from the visual summary of around 25% and a doubling in the percentage of people that got all questions right. No significant change in trust, which is the bottom row here. Again, I'll come back to that later. But key question, given what I told you about the visual summary, of course, is what's driving this result? Is it the simpler language, i.e. the improved readability? Is it something about the word count? Is it something about the visuals? So in the next experiment, we ran those versions again, the monetary policy summary and the visual summary, but we did 4 variations. We edited both versions so that the word count is the same. And then we ran an extra version of each with and without visuals. So that gives us a test of holding word count constant. Is it the lower reading grade or the visuals in the visual summary that are doing the work in terms of improving comprehension? And what we find is that actually visuals, even though it's called the visual summary, were not really the main driving effect of the improvement in comprehension. You can see this by comparing the first 2 bars on this chart, where we take the complex monetary policy summary and we put the visuals in it. And you see there's barely any difference in the comprehension score as measured out of 5. You can also see it on the right-hand side of the chart with the visual summary when we swap the visuals in and out. Instead, the main difference comes from going from the monetary policy summary to the visual summary, and the actual kind of decrease, or rather kind of increase, depending on kind of what scale you're looking at, but the improvement in comprehension effectively comes from the lower reading grade of the visual summary. So, can we go any better? The last thing that we did, the final variation that we tested as part of this series, was about relatability. So what we mean by this was trying to take every single sort of bit that we possibly could of the summary and try to make it as relevant and relatable as possible to people and their daily lives. So that included things like trying to put more first and second person pronouns in, so saying you instead of consumers. We also swapped in more familiar terms, so talking about price growth rather than inflation. We tried to put in relatable examples. So when we talked about inflation, we'd then talk about the cost of groceries. When we talked about exchange rate changes, we'd then bring in an example of holiday costs. And we also put in some elements of personalization. There's an example here on the right of the slide where we put in an interactive chart on regional unemployment so that you could have a look at unemployment in your area, not just the UK. So when we do that, and I should say that the other thing we did was sort of try again, as with the other experiment, hold everything else constant in terms of the word count and the reading grade level. When we do that, we get further improvements on comprehension on top of the visual summary of around 19%. Interestingly, this time, we actually also get an improvement on that trust measure. So that's really great because here we seem to have comprehension and trust working together. And I think it's worth just saying that this isn't something that we thought was going to be a given at the start. And in fact, when we were developing these, there were some concerns that actually, if it looked like we were effectively dumbing down the information, then that might actually reduce trust in it. But in fact, we see here that that doesn't have to be the case. So just to quickly wrap up in terms of the key findings. So the new innovation from the Bank of England introducing this visual summary improves comprehension compared to what we had before by around 25%. Most of that boost in comprehension seems to be driven by the reading grade, not really the visuals themselves. And finally, relating the content to people's daily lives further increases comprehension by another 19%, as well as trust as well on the different scales that we were measuring. So I'll just very quickly talk a little bit about where we want to take this next. When we finished this, we very much felt like it was a sort of first step, early example of what could be done to test how to improve comprehension and trust, but it does leave many unanswered questions. So firstly, baseline comprehension is still low. We made a difference, but it's still low. So is there more we can do, especially to explain harder concepts? And I think, James's work on how to explain uncertainty is absolutely a really important part of that. Secondly, would those changes in comprehension that we measured in an online environment, would that actually result in changes in actual behaviour down the line? Interesting question. Would people start to factor this into their financial decisions? We don't know. Thirdly, of course, people don't regularly access the Bank of England website or indeed the website of many economic institutions. So key question is, how does the way that economic institutions put out information and communicate affect media reporting, which is the way most people access this information? And finally, I think there's a huge amount of potential to look at where testing can add value in other areas across other economic institutions and in terms of other types of communications, for example, speeches, press releases, announcements. So a sort of start, but sort of very much more to do, I think, is our kind of headline on all of this. If you'd like to read any more, our article on this is out in the Journal of Monetary Economics. And also BIT has a report on the behavioural economy, which brings in our sort of more general kind of wider view on how behavioural insights can potentially be used to improve economic policy making. Thanks very much. I'll hand back to Sumit.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to all the speakers. It's an incredibly insightful presentation, but also very complimentary. I'm going to hand over to Mike for some comments as a discussant. Mike's background is in the Royal Statistical Society, but he's also worked in various roles. I'm hoping he'll be able to add some of his own views on what he's heard so far, but also how we might be able to take this forward. So Mike, over to you, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Sumit. Can I say I equally am pleased to be invited to discuss this important topic today, particularly having been an advisor to the ESCO research on public understanding that Johnny's paper considered at the beginning. And I must congratulate my collaborative authors of each of their papers. I think collectively present a powerful argument for improvements in the communication of economic statistics. I should say at the outset that this is not a new problem. I worked for over 30 years in the Government Statistical Service, finishing as Director of Policy in ONS during the 2000s. And improving the presentation and communication of statistics was a recurring theme throughout that period. So hopefully this session today will give some stimulus to making these long-awaited improvements. I have no slides, and in the limited time available, I don't intend to discuss the papers, given that they speak for themselves. Rather, I wanted to explore what messages came out of them in terms of what can be done to improve matters for the future. And in so doing, I think it's important to reiterate the benefits of good communication to counter what Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the bank, described as the twin deficit of economics, namely needing an improved understanding of the economy to judge policies and to enhance trust in government statistics, something to which I return later. I confess I wasn't particularly surprised by the general lack of knowledge and understanding of economic statistics in the survey that Johnny conducted. And I sat in on a couple of the focus groups. And I just wanted to talk through quickly three things in particular that stood out for me in terms of the public's understanding of and trust in the statistics. Firstly, their trust in the value of a particular statistic was heavily dependent on the individual's personal experience or that of his or her environment. As Johnny said, examples of people's own experience of price movements compared to the CPI, or local levels of unemployment compared to the national figure. And the sentiments behind the now famous cry of the lady in Newcastle, that that's your GDP, not ours, was a common feature in the ESCO study. Secondly, knowledge of the underlying methodology for a particular statistic improved the focus group's understanding of trust, understanding and trust in the figures. I think this is a particularly important point, which we as professionals do not really appreciate. We fully know what the underlying methodology is. We either think it's not important, that the user needs to know, or it's too complicated. But as an example of this, when the discussion on the inflation got particularly bogged down, and I explained what the basket of goods actually meant, it elicited the response from one of the users there. If only I'd known that, I would have seen things so differently. And I was also horrified to discover that the hoary old chestnut of manipulation of the unemployment statistics was still being trotted out 40 years later. The third thing was a more specific issue, and that was the definition of coverage of the measures of employment and unemployment, which I have to say caused incredulity in some focus group members, in particular the inclusion of individuals on 0 hours contracts in the employment figures. And I think this is an area where ONS needs to consider whether they can produce, as it were, estimates of the popular understanding of employment, unemployment, along similar lines to what they do in a sense now with inflation, with a CPI and a CPIH, where one contains housing costs and the other doesn't. And of course, before that, we used to have an RPI with housing costs and an RPI without. So I don't think it's beyond statistical integrity to be producing those two sorts of estimates. So what do I take from Johnny's report and my observations in the focus groups? As Sumit mentioned in his introduction, what's given the impetus to a lot of the work in ONS on economic statistics has come from Sir Charlie Bean's review in 2016. And I think Charlie gave a good summary of the need for improvement in the communication of economic statistics in one of his recommendations, which stated, statistical releases should contain clear and prominent commentary on the quality of those statistics, noting any significant limitations and also highlighting any scope for misinterpretation. But on the basis of the ESCO study and the Behavioural Insight Team study, which we've heard about today, I would add to that list two further things. Firstly, a simple explanation of the underlying methodology, and where appropriate, a recognition of what the Behavioural Insight Team calls relatable content. And I recall reading somewhere in preparing for this discussion, a statement, which I can't now trace, which said something along the lines of, a professional sees things through a professional eye, but a good communicator sees things through the user's eyes. And I fully support Johnny's statement on the need for the professionals to get closer to users. The focus groups were a real eye-opener for me on just how limited at times users' perceptions of the statistics were. I should also add, incidentally, that Bean went on to say that much of the media's and market commentary and political discourse treats statistics with a precision and reverence that is totally unwarranted, the point being emphasized in James's presentation about uncertainty in estimates. Now, there is no silver bullet to the improvement in communication. The situation calls for a number of separate measures across a wide and disparate range of practitioners. It's a very diverse group we're talking about here, with the producers, the intermediaries, such as journalists, as commentators, and then ultimately journalists. But amongst those measures, I was particularly struck, which I hadn't really seen until now, by the benefits gained by the Bank of England from the Behavioural Insight Team's work on simplified commentaries and relatable content. And I would certainly encourage ONS to consider how similar techniques could be applied to their communications too. I think it was very insightful, that piece of work. And we must not assume that the responsibility for improved communication rests just with the producers, and ONS in particular. And we must also address the role of economic commentators and journalists as intermediaries in the communication of economic statistics and concepts. And I think an area which has been neglected, and I think we should strive to ensure that suitable modules on economic measurement are included in university journalism courses in the future. So where do we go from here? Well, fortunately, as a result of the Bean Review, the Royal Economic Society and the Royal Statistical Society established an Economic Statistics Working Group, ESWG, in 2017, which hitherto has focused on training and seminars for economists on the measurement of economic statistics. But that working group has since expanded to also include senior representatives of ONS, ESCO, and the Society of Professional Economists. So we now have a group of representatives from a wide range of interested bodies in economic statistics that meets regularly to discuss the matter. And this topic is now on ESWG's agenda. And with others, I've been tasked to map out a plan for future consideration of the issues. So hopefully today's session could usefully contribute to that discussion. So I'll hand you back to Sumit.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you to all the speakers. As I say, I think what struck me amongst all of the material there was just some of the common threads that there were in terms of how we understand not only the user community, but how do we actually engage and improve our communications amongst that. And I don't think it's just a responsibility of one type of producer, but I think across the broad spectrum of the economics community. So we'll open up the Q&A. So I'll ask the panel to come in. I know we've got a couple of questions that have come in, which I'll raise here. But if there are any others, please do post those. The first one might be specifically to James and his material on communicated data uncertainty. It says that the media might be more likely to report that GDP increased by 1.5% during the last year, i.e. not even mention the estimate. So I think this is in the context of the communication practices. And so the question is, was there a reason not to include this as a treatment? So you might just want to, if it's okay, James, just clarify what was the treatment and then what was the control as well.
Okay, will do. I mean, it's a good, interesting question, and to anticipate sort of things, a bit like Nida said, we very much view this particular, the two surveys we've carried out as the first steps. It would indeed be nice to consider alternative treatments, but the sort of justification, if I put it that way, for the communication tool given to the control group, where, as the question said, we did talk about, we did say GDP is estimated to have whatever increased or decreased by this set amount during the last year. That language is a copy paste job from the latest ONS press release. So in effect, our proximate motivation in these surveys was to assess ONS's current communication strategies. Then to the treatment groups, as I sort of explained, we added in additional information around that GDP estimate. But you're right. It would indeed be interesting, firstly, as both Nida and Mike touched on, to see what effects there are on public perceptions of data uncertainty when that communication is filtered, to use Nida's language, via the BBC or the Financial Times or Twitter or whatever it is. That would be very interesting to see, and indeed one could in effect replicate the sort of experimental design that Anna and I set out to test those additional treatments. And indeed, as I did, I think, briefly mention, internationally, practice does vary as to how the statistical offices currently communicate their data. As I said, the ONS is in fact sort of an international rarity in referring to its GDP numbers as estimates. The BEA, Statistics Canada, to give a couple of examples, do not. They just refer to what's happened to GDP. So I guess what I'm also saying, and it'd be great to get funding to support this research agenda, it'd be lovely to extend the sorts of experimental surveys that we've carried out here to other countries, to other economic variables, to look at unemployment and things like Johnny touched on, where perhaps there's more sort of conceptual, more uncertainties, more tension around actually what the variable means than arguably there is for GDP. But I hope that answers the question and gives you an idea of perhaps what we'd like to do in future work too.
Thanks very much, James. And I might actually invite either Nida and or Mike to come in on that point on, I suppose, the media as an intermediary. So I think what James has spoken about is almost testing ONS practices and then variations on that. But I think both of you touched upon the role of an intermediary in terms of communication. I think that brings together quite nicely about, I don't think it's simply one individual or one organization, but much more collective responsibility. So I just didn't know if you guys want to come in at all around the extent to which the media may, for example, just not even refer to estimates or data uncertainty and how they communicate. And is that something that we need to work on as a economics profession? So Nida, I may invite you in first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really good question. So I think there are two missing parts at the moment that needs further research. One is when people read stuff that's being reported in the media, what do they take and understand from that? So you could imagine a study that perhaps looks at all the news reports that come out after the ONS or the Bank of England or whoever it is have released some stats or some news, puts that in front of different participants, and then we check to see how much they've kind of understood about the news stats that have been put out, and are some media outlets doing a better job than others. I think the other thing is sort of trying to work out whether the ONS or the Bank of England or economic institutions, when they put this simple stuff to understand on their websites, does that actually get used by journalists? And do journalists use that to write better reports? Or could it even be that, previously, maybe it would only be the financial correspondent that would bother looking at the sort of detailed central bank report, but maybe by having these more accessible pieces, these more accessible summaries, maybe that means that then your kind of more general journalists pick it up as well. And so perhaps that ends up being good for public trust and understanding. So I think there are sort of two kind of unanswered questions. And I think, yeah, totally agree with James, actually. It'd be really great to kind of have, some of the sort of funding actually to kind of do more of this work. One thing actually, maybe while I have the floor, I might add as a reflection on sort of James's point on uncertainty. I think it's so interesting, that finding that putting the uncertainty out there and making it clear didn't undermine trust. I wonder whether that would still hold for economic institutions that are making forecasts about the future, where often the uncertainty range is quite a lot bigger than what the ONS has to deal with when it's revising estimates. And I wonder whether when people see that, and that's communicated to people, would that undermine trust at all? Don't know, open question, but I think it would be really interesting to explore.
Thank you very much. And I might pick up on that point. But first, Mike, is there anything you want to come in?
Yeah, well, yes. Thank you, Sumit. I mean, there are a number of things I could say on this particular point. And certainly picking up Nida's point, when I was head of profession in 2 departments, I used to exercise the rule to all the statisticians that they ought to produce commentary that was simple but immediately transferable, so the journalist could put it straight in to the newspapers. So that was always the goal. But the price of doing that is by keeping it simple and short, because they only wanted short commentaries. You perhaps you missed out salient points, particularly the points that have been made today about how important it is for readers to understand where the figures come from and so on. So there's a tension there, Summit, between how you do it. But I mean, certainly that was the message we tried to get across, and certainly the same when I was in ONS. Make the copy, produce copy for the journalist, basically. But I think the other strand of all of this is that there's 2 kinds of journalists, I think. Well, there's many kinds of journalists, but 2 in particular in the context of what we're talking about today. And there are the journalists that write for the broadsheets, who typically are very good economists in their own right. I'm talking about the Ben Hughes of this world, Chris Giles and people like that, whose understanding of statistics is economic statistics is extremely good. But I don't think the same applies in the red tops. And I think there the situation is much more one of a journalist just being somebody who's given the economy or business to deal with. And I remember having a discussion with David Rind a number of years ago when he was Vice Chancellor of City University, but he was also at the time the chairman of the Statistics Commission. And I said, can't you do anything on your courses to improve this? And he said, the problem basically, Mike, is that editors set these journalists a task to report on something. And if the copy doesn't meet those very political aspirations, then it gets spiked. So it's trying to overcome that particular kind of a problem, I think. And that will always be there. But I think if we had more understanding by the journalists of where the figures come from, how they're produced, and so on. That would help. The other point to make is that I detected in my long period of working in the GSS quite a difference in the quality of the national journalists on the one hand from the regional journalists on the other. And we mustn't forget that a lot of the news will come through local regional papers and so on. So there's a welter of different aspects that need to be, I think, researched further in all of this in order to get some better outcome.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I think one point you've raised there, which I think is a really important one, is we talk a lot about the user community and how there's kind of a wide-ranging nature there. And I think that's something that we face as a stats office quite challenging. How do you almost adjust or tailor your service to the different types of users? But I think that also varies within types of users. So you spoke about the media there. So that was a really interesting insight. I know there's a couple of bits which we might come back to, but I'm also aware there's a couple of bits in the Q&A which we wanted to pick up. So Johnny, this first one is for you, although I welcome other insights as well. And it kind of referred to your findings on the labour market. So, and how you spoke about essentially unemployment versus inactivity. And the question is, what would you say are the implications in terms of economic research focusing on big picture questions versus wordsmithing or teasing out mechanisms that might not be of interest to the general public? So I suppose you could think of this a little bit as kind of the relatable content, but in terms of, I guess, these boundaries I think you spoke of. So I was just wondering if you wanted to share any views there in terms of the implications in terms of how we think about communications.
Yeah, I mean, it suddenly points out some issues in terms of communicating unemployment statistics. And I mean, I think one of the things that springs to mind is that we should, as economists, we should not take for granted that even though unemployment, like kind of at the outset, is an easy concept and people like kind of understand roughly what it is, you can't actually take for granted that we all understand the same thing when we're referring to unemployment or the unemployment rate. In fact, you can easily argue that economists, that it's not a very intuitive concept at all, that the economists are the ones that have managed to define and make up a strange concept, so to speak. So it's important that we don't assume that when we talk about the unemployment rate to the public that they understand the same thing. And obviously those kind of misperceptions can become very dangerous, because if people mean different things, it means that when you say the unemployment rate is 5%, that some people will find that unbelievable and start distrusting that. So I think one of the things is, because we know that people might understand different things, be careful about using numbers. The numbers can be fairly meaningless if you don't have that common understanding. Use narratives, context, speak about the labor market in more broader terms. Potentially use broader labor market indicators. There are like loads of, ONS itself publishes other labor market indicators and researchers as well. So use them as well, although I recognize that journalists might quite often want that like kind of simple story that's very neatly captured in the one catch-all figure, the unemployment rate. Interestingly, and I'm still grappling with this one personally, do we in our communication give people more information about the unemployment rate, how it's collected, how it's measured, and so on? It's a difficult one because, I mean, first of all, journalists, as Mike said, want it short and sweet, and there's not always room to provide that extra information. And sometimes when you provide extra information, which we've seen in some of our work, it kind of begs more questions. What, if you say, just to take an example, if you try to explain, sampling uncertainty in the unemployment rate because it's based on the labor force survey, the household survey, if you start describing or explaining this to the public, we've found that, you know, people can react quite strongly to that, and it begs a lot more questions and you know, takes you down routes that are quite difficult in a short space of time. So yeah, no, there's lots to think about there.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Nida, I didn't know if you wanted to come in at all there on that point, in terms of, in your presentation, you spoke about content that people can relate to, but I wasn't sure if there was any findings at all in terms of concepts, and it may not have been, but the way I took your work was more in terms of what Johnny spoke of, I think, in terms of kind of narrative and context. But I didn't know if you had any views at all. Is there something we need to kind of, I guess, that potential gap between statistical frameworks and what people actually understand in terms of their actual experiences, and whether that can be something that's reflecting communications? I just didn't know if you had any views on that at all.
Yeah, so I suppose, I mean, one thing we actually kind of say in the paper is that our concept of relatability is made up of quite a few different things, and even that could do with some further investigation to break it down, because I suppose we did get to concepts a little bit, in the sense that we did take sort of the more kind of economic terms for things like inflation and then translate that into price growth, or like so there was a section in the summary that talked about the impact of exchange rates on prices, and we deliberately put in an example of when you go on holiday, what might be the price of like a meal in another country, because this has happened. So I suppose to that extent, we did get into what do these concepts mean for you. And, you know, that as part of the sort of general bundle of what we called relatability was effective. I do think, though, some of the issues raised in Johnny's report, particularly around unemployment, are actually quite a lot tougher to tackle. And I think, you know, I think it's probably because there are a couple of things going on, right? I think, you know, in a sort of like well-functioning sort of like political economy, what we want is these stats to be out there so that people can really understand what's going on in the economy, use that to hold policymakers to account. And I think with unemployment, you've actually got like a few things going on. Like, one, you want to know how well is the labour market working for people who want to get into work, but you also want to know how much of like my taxpayer money is like going on benefit claimants, X, Y, Z. And so my guess is that that's a little bit why, like, when you ask the public, they start to get a little bit confused about what exactly are these stats showing, and are they showing what I think they ought to show? So I think that's quite tricky. I think also, of course, like underlying all of this is that everyone's got quite limited attention as well. So one of the bits of the experiment that actually that is in our working paper but didn't make it into the final paper was a version where we simply reduced a lot of the text that was in one of the summaries, really kind of stripped it down to its component parts. And whilst that didn't perform as well as our relatability version, it did perform pretty well. So that was just an indication of, you know, more content also reduces comprehension as well, because people just aren't going to pay attention to all of it. So I think there's also a piece around, if you are going to try and kind of put more nuance and complexity out there, how do you do it? Can you even do it in a single sort of press release that comes out after a stat goes out? Maybe that's not the most effective time to do that. Maybe it's, you know, a bigger piece around education as well.
Thank you for that. Actually, I might just pick up on that point, actually, because a few of you have spoken about it. The extent to which there is potentially a trade-off, I suppose, between the volume of content and information, but also how comprehensible that is by the wider public. And I think that's something as an NSI, but I imagine others here may sometimes battle, is you think that publishing all the available information can only improve people's understanding because you're being as open and transparent. But I'm also showing metrics about how long someone spends on average on an article. And so, and it is something I don't think we've mastered yet. And I said, when I say we, I don't mean just the ONS, but I think collectively. So I just didn't know if anyone had any views on that. Mike, I might come to you first on that one, because I know you spoke about it as well. So did you have any reflections either from the past or your findings from the focus groups that you sat in on?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a real tension summit, and as I pointed out earlier, and as Nida's outlined herself, if you want to get the message across clearly and retain people's attention, then it's got to be short, sharp, and sweet. But equally, you do want to be able to keep people informed. So it's not something easily done in a statistical reach. I mean, we've got a contrast here between what Nida was looking at with the bank's periodic monetary policy report and statistical releases, and the whole ethos of the latter is short and sweet. But I do wonder whether or not we should be doing more, and ONS should be doing more, in putting up alongside each of those releases when they come out some kind of explanatory notes and so on. Not the ones footnotes of press releases, which nobody reads, of course, but rather more just have for each of the generic topics that ONS produces statistics on, a summary page of what's there, so that the reader can go to it, or journalists in particular can go to it. I mean, the big problem, of course, is I keep making the point that the greater majority of the public will not be reading ONS websites. They'll be getting their stuff from the red tops. And it's making sure that the people that write there are sufficiently well informed. So it's almost a conundrum in a way. I don't have an easy answer to it, but it's something which, it was a real eye-opener for me as I tried to convey in my short discussion, the significance of this in listening to people in 2 focus groups. Johnny assured me that he was getting the same message from nearly all the focus groups. So it is an inherent problem.
Thank you, Mike. And I'm pleased that I'm not the only one who's battling this conundrum, because I think it is something that we need to learn more about how we can tackle it. I think there's certainly an appetite to do so, but I think getting to the bottom of it is quite a challenge, but hopefully one that we can kind of improve on. I'm conscious of time, and there is one more question in the Q&A, which I was keen to ask the panel. James, I'll come to you first on this one, but others may wish to chip in as well. Is there a role for communicating not just statistical or data uncertainty, but also conceptual uncertainty around economic statistics? And GDP and even employment, apologies, are concepts which change over time with evolving international guidance. So is there a role for communicating to the public that these aren't fixed concepts? So James, I might come to you on that one, because I know you explicitly looked at kind of data uncertainty and revisions. But I know you and I have spoken a lot more about just kind of broader types of uncertainty. So I don't know if you had any views on this, and I may even be a bit bold here and ask, do you have any views on how that could be done as well, just given everything else you've heard as well? So if I come to you, James, but please others feel free to come in as well afterwards.
Sure, and short answer to a very good but long question is yes. I certainly think there is a role for communicating conceptual uncertainties, but I also agree with the previous panelists. The insights of from Johnny's study, that it's sort of horses for courses in terms of communication strategies. No doubt the Statistical Office, the central bank, will communicate in one way when targeting a certain type of user and communicate quite differently when targeting another. And so, in a sense, when communicating, shall we say, with the reader of the Red Top newspaper, who I guess are part of the sort of public survey that Anna and I survey, no doubt there's perhaps not a lot of space to get into detailed discussion of the conceptual uncertainties and debates you and I might have about what GDP measures, what it doesn't measure, etc. It's at best you're going to get across something, get across a broad idea of what GDP is, and indeed, an open question is is it worthwhile, is it helpful to think about how to make that concept more relatable? And this is in fact something, as you know, that Anna and I bounced back and forth on. In effect, the question we were posing ourselves was yes, we found that it seems to help to communicate GDP via these quantitative visual ways. It encourages the public to view the data as a little bit uncertain and correctly infer the degree of uncertainty associated with the estimates. But does it in fact affect any decisions, any economic decisions they make? So what that we're able to communicate a little bit better? And you know, to get to that, we need to think about how to make GDP perhaps, or how GDP does relate to people. So I think we can harness a lot of the wisdom from Johnny's study, and you know, and answer quickly, thinking about your question, what might we do to improve conceptually our understanding of uncertainty? I mean, that's a big one in the time time available. So perhaps I'll sort of, you know, just refer back to what Johnny said on that.
Thank you, James. Johnny, I didn't know if you wanted to come in there with any views based on some of your findings from the focus groups and just this broader concept of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that, I mean, obviously, I don't have any kind of like experimental surveys backing this up, but just hearing what goes on in focus groups, a lot of public participants do have different understandings of like methodology and what they kind of expect these things to do, and they quite often, you know, think there's one answer to a question, or that, you know, for instance, with unemployment, the fact that it has sometimes changed in methodology is something that people kind of use as a reasoning for why they would distrust it. And, you know, some people also sometimes mention, well, I've heard that the inflation basket is changing once in a while, like they put different things in and take different things out. And I, you know, some people say they can kind of understand why, but they also say this really opens it to manipulation and, you know, getting the figure you want. So all I'm saying, I guess, is that these kind of things need to be tested, because there's always the worry that if you communicate uncertainty, that you're going to erode trust. And I guess that was, you know, the whole point of James's paper, is that worry is there, and you definitely need to get some research to back it up before you start communicating it.
Thanks very much, Johnny. We've only got a minute or so left. So I didn't know if either Neil or Mike just want to share any final reflections on that point. No worries if not.
No, not really. I think James and Johnny have said it all, really, from my point of view. Something, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And I can see Neil as well on the camera there. So look, I just want to take this opportunity to thank each of the panel here to share their views and their findings. I found it fascinating, and I found it incredibly complementary how you guys built on similar concepts and principles there. And I think there's a lot for us to take away, both as the stats office in the UK, but I think the wider profession, and hopefully that was of interest to those on the line. I want to thank everyone for their attendance here, and the Q&A was really useful insight in terms of what I think is a really topical concept. And I'd also like to thank Suraj on the line, who's been facilitating all the IT problems and making my life a lot easier. So thank you all very much for your time. Take care. I hope to speak to you soon, and maybe next year in person as well. Thank you very much.